Hi, and welcome to Feature Fridays. My name is Guy Bartram, Director of Product Marketing in our VMware Clouds Provider Business Unit. And today I'm joined by Daniel, Joerg, and Tomas. So welcome, Daniel and Tomas, first to Feature Fridays. So thank you very much, guys, for joining. And Joerg, always a pleasure to have you as well. Daniel, let's start with you. Just a quick introduction. Who are you and what is your role?
Yeah, my name is Daniel Quirke. I'm with VMware 11 years. I work in the vCloud Director team here in EMEA, and I'm a staff engineer there in that space. So my role will be mainly kind of backline working with engineering, plugging gaps in the product, but also assisting some of the other TSCs when the issues get a bit too technical for them.
Excellent. Thanks, Daniel. And Tomas, over to you next.
Hello, guys. My name is Tomas Fotja. Glad to be here. I'm a staff architect inside the cloud solutions team, and mostly working with vCloud Director, with customers, as well as engineering, and then everything I know I try to share through my blog that probably many people know at foitawordpress.com.
Yeah, it's a great blog. And Joerg.
Yeah, Joerg, I'm a technical product manager in VMware's Cloud Director team.
Okay, well, thank you guys for joining today again. So today's episode, we're going to cover some of the VCD aspects around troubleshooting, issue identification in particular, how to work out where the issue is coming from, the type of symptoms it might be, you might be looking for in terms of log files or behaviors, and then how you can hopefully either fix an issue or help gather some of the data necessary for GSS to escalate and get the issue to the correct department quickest. So Tomas, let's start with you perhaps, and can you give me a bit of an overview in your mind when you're looking at a large environment in a service provider? Issues possibly come up quite a lot. How do you start that process of trying to identify where the issue is?
Right. So obviously, it depends who is the person who is trying to identify the issue. If it's the end customer, right? The end customer just sees their browser and some non-descriptive error message that doesn't really help them, and that's all they can really see and do anyway, because they don't understand what's actually behind the whole cloud, how the cloud is set up. So at the end, it must be the cloud architect, the administrators, and the provider that actually is able to start troubleshooting the issue and starting to identify it. And then, since they understand what's the architecture of the cloud, they should be able to then, focus through some, quick troubleshooting steps to find out what is the actual area where the issue is occurring, trying to reproduce it, and then obviously create the most specific GSS ticket if necessary, or maybe resolve it on their own. So the whole point of the cloud is, right, it's providing services through different components to the end users, and obviously it could be quite complex architecture. And you really should, as a provider, architect, or admin, understand what are the components, how they are set up, how they communicate with each other, and then try to go through the whole stack from the end customer and their browser through the internet connection to the load balancers, the front end VCD cells, the databases, the other components underneath the whole platform, to basically be able to assess where the actual issue might be happening, and then dive deeper into it.
Yes, I suppose there's two types of kind of issues really. There's proactive issue identification and reactive issue identification. And obviously, reactive, something's happened, something has gone wrong, something's failed. Proactive is maybe looking for a particular trend, maybe it's capacity, maybe it's latency, and raising an alert on that. What do you see in terms of how providers manage their events or alarms today? Do you see a lot of proactive management going and being used? And if so, which kind of tools do you see, and how far does that proactiveness go out? does it extend down to user sessions, perhaps?
Well, definitely every cloud that is offered as a service, should be designed in such a way that you are aware of the capacity that the cloud is using, what is the headroom, or what is from the performance perspective on whatever, capacity perspective, because obviously at the end, it's not, unlimited resource, and the provider has to take care of that. So from the tooling perspective, VCD on its own provides just a simple alerting via emails. That's definitely not enough. You definitely need additional tooling on top of that would monitor the availability of the resources from the, actually that they are available, or from the capacity perspective through the VCD point of view, through the VCD objects, or then you can go directly into the actual platform vSphere components, monitor the clusters, etc. So the way you would usually do that, right, you would use tooling like Virtualized Operations that is able to give you the capacity perspective, maybe some out of norm behavior alerts as well. So that's great for that. Then for the actual availability of the individual components, right, you should have some monitoring system that would query the endpoints and give you in regular intervals, information about if everything is green or not, and you should start worrying about it. So, and those are usually third-party components that could help you there. So, and that's really the must. You really have to do so if you are offering a production type service and are charging money as a provider to your end customers.
Yeah, absolutely.
In addition to that, I have seen some customers actually using the APIs and the automation tools that we have for VCD. For example, Terraform, but with the REST APIs, you can use pretty much whatever client technology that you want to create some kind of a smoke test strategy. So they have a separate organization VDC that's not related to any real tenant, but it's like a dummy tenant that they use for just to do some basic smoke testing of certain procedures, like deploying new VApps. And then they use some automation to just deploy a VApp into that org VDC, do some certain network connectivity, check that the VApp gets started properly, and then after a certain runtime, they delete that VApp again and restart that cycle. And so you have some ongoing action and churn within the that one organization VDC, and that already gives you some kind of a smoke test in software engineering. If something breaks there, then that's already one good starting point for troubleshooting.
Yeah, that's a great idea, and you can either look at the fact that the test actually worked and the things were created, or you could look at the time it took to do the different API calls, to do the different creation or updates of the assets within VCD, and look for any anomalies there. So, for example, database being stressed or whatever, it might take a little bit longer to create something. Okay, so obviously there's a lot of components in play here when we're looking at a full production cloud environment. We've got VCD, we've got NSX, we've got vSphere, vCenter. There may be other third parties in there as well. Getting this all working in unison is quite a hard thing to do in any case, but obviously keeping it at a certain service level is critical for what a cloud provider is doing. And like Thomas said, they should be doing sort of proactive testing to ensure that service level is met. Daniel, do you want to just talk us through some of the some of the key components within that environment and how they talk to each other and how they relate?
Yeah, I think one of the crucial things to call out, and it's kind of looping back to both Joerg and Thomas's point, is that as soon as you introduce any form of monitoring or automation, there is an inherent load that's going to be placed on vCloud Director itself. One of the things that we do find is very important here in GSS is sizing your server group accordingly. So following the VMware validated designs and those new appliance sizing guidelines that engineering have developed, we can quickly bring up, I'll just share my screen. just give people an idea of.
It's a great point before you move off that. I mean, we've created these validated designs for cloud providers, and they do address a scalability aspect. I think it's small, medium, large kind of footprints for each type of design. And there is a lot of providers out there who have built their own clouds, not using VVDs. There's also a lot of providers who have built clouds using the VVD specification, and hopefully they've benefited from that, from the interoperability testing and the scalability testing that we do, to be able to then provide a cloud with a level of stability for the service they're looking to deliver, and the SLA. So I think that's a really key point for cloud providers to try and minimize the complexity in their stack and the additional perhaps tweaking that they may have done, which would take it out of the ordinary configuration into something that would be harder to find and harder to support.
Yeah, one of the key aspects kind of on that would be, especially for service providers who have kind of upgraded over time, what might have been kind of minimum requirements or default deployment parameters, have seemed to be insufficient. So, if you've deployed appliances on, 9.7 or 10.0 and you're now on 10.3, you're completely undersized, even from a single appliance perspective, so that's something that's not going to be flagged, unfortunately, by the application itself. So even revisit it, even if you've done so, even within the last version or two, there's probably some things that are outdated there.
Yeah, that's one sort of guidance that we always have to look at the sizing guidelines that are now part of the documentation. Even if you do an upgrade, just look through the installation and upgrade guide to check about the sizing guidelines that are now part of the documentation.
Yeah, another great point is that clouds don't stay still. They need to be upgraded. We have, upgrades of software, we have patches and security releases as well. So it's in a constant state of flux, really, in terms of the processes that are going on. So it is particularly important to start off with and continue with a stable configuration, one that VMware has endorsed and tested ourselves as well. So we've got that starting place where we can accurately gauge what's going on. And I guess the VVD is one way, using cloud provider lifecycle manager to deploy a cloud, or getting a VCF stack in there as well. These are all predictable and known configurations for VMware to support, so it obviously makes it easier for us to support.
And I suppose you have the split as well, from a customer's perspective. It's not just the service providers that we know of to kind of factor in. Some enterprise customers that will now have access to vCloud. And then I suppose you have to take in the kind of SaaS model. So there's a lot of kind of moving parts, even outside of VMware itself, out in the actual public domain.
Yeah, and I guess for a service provider, I mean, issues are critical, more critical than perhaps an enterprise. If you're not able to deliver the service or have a customer access the service, then that's your SLAs being breached, and also, it's a reputational thing as well. So Daniel, do you want to just show us the components that you said you were going to put up?
So that's just a brief glimpse of an example environment. Again, a lot of these are interchangeable. You can have customers that are running NSXT instead of NSXV. The sizing here as well would obviously vary. Some customers might have a smaller subset of ESXi clusters. Some might go for large clusters in small numbers. And again, there's just a brief example there. So if you look at like Active Directory and SMTP, they're just some kind of third-party parts that we're kind of reaching out, and they're reaching back into the cloud. But I think in a nutshell, if we kind of focus in and around here, really what's going on there and what's driving it all would be API calls. And they're all going to come in over 4.4.3 in most, if not all of those applications. So in relation to, we'll say, VCD for example, VCD to NSX, the actual integration there is so tight knit that VCD itself has its own logs that will take NSX API calls and push them out, so that you could look at those in particular. Whereas, vRealize Orchestrator wouldn't have its own logging here on the vCloud side. But again, once you kind of break down the elements themselves, it doesn't really matter if you're talking to VRO or you're talking to NSX. From a customer's perspective, and more so from a service provider, it's an endpoint talking to another endpoint, and it's just tracing those API calls, and that's the key kind of element there when you are going between those. But even within vCloud Director itself, since we've changed to the HTML5 UI, you can bring up the browser console, which is available in any browser, and you can actually see the API calls being sent to the backend as you're making the operational changes in the vCloud UI. And even from a GSS perspective, if we are looking at a case live with a customer, that's probably the first place that we're going to start looking. What's happening, what's being sent, what's being received. Very similar to even if it was between VCD and another endpoint.
Okay, so in that respect, then we have a lot of API calls being managed and executed across a lot of different OSS here. We also have a UI in Cloud Director, and all of the products have UIs as well. But a UI particularly that we can actually see the API calls that are being orchestrated. I believe you can record the UI, is that right, for troubleshooting purposes now?
Yes, we'll kind of break it into, and maybe I'll show you, probably be the easiest. In a browser here, if we you'll see that the API calls here are being recorded. So if you kind of jump back here and you were to take a look at your list of virtual machines, you can see that these are all of the API calls that are being sent in the backend. So even to take this machine here for an example, if you wanted to get the details in that particular VM, and you can see here that we've replicated a common enough issue that customers are hitting. Again, we can kind of jump back in here, and you'll see straight off that we have a 500 internal server error. There's your API call, and with your gets, what you're kind of really looking for here is the response. And whilst that's not kind of great to look at, that's going to give us an actual stack trace. Now, the stack trace itself is going to be captured in the logs as well. But even if we were to jump back here to the headers, there's still a lot of useful information. So you can see that they're the request headers that get sent, and they're your response headers there. So you can even pull out the request ID here from the API call itself. And if we were to bring up the vCloud Director cell, if we were just to go into the logs directory, could just do maybe a grep against the debug logs, which would be our main source there. So our vCloud container debug log. And let's take a quick look at that. Sorry, there's the stack trace, so it's going to be identical to what you'll get here in the browser logs. This will obviously be not formatted, so it won't be readable until maybe you extract it out to Notepad++. But if you are logging a ticket with the likes of GSS, even to provide something like that, along with a screenshot of the error and the logs, you'd still probably want GSS to just take a quick look through those logs beforehand, just to make sure that everything we've seen is there. But something like that kind of is gold when you're logging a support request, because I think, as Thomas pointed out at the start, you want to set a focus area for when you're logging that ticket. You want to ensure that you're coming into the correct team. When you log something like this, it's just a Java stack trace, so it's going to be read the same as any other application. So it goes from a top down, and these are the last things that it would have hit. Now, what you'll notice is that there's probably a mix of VMware code and third-party code. So it's a good idea to maybe not try understand, but at least have an idea as to what vCloud was last doing before it went into the third-party code. So you can see that the last few things it's doing there is it's looking to get a unique result. It's finding a host by valref. So anytime you see something like valref, moid, moref, they're the unique vCenter identifiers for every object that exists within vCenter. So for us, a host, we'd refer to it as a managed server here on the support side, because that's what the database kind of reflects. But in short, what it's saying there is it's trying to get a unique host reference from the database, because it needs to get vCenter information. If we quickly jump back here, you'll see a lot of this information would have to come from vCenter. So it's looking to do those kind of lookups to get those kind of values. So from a GSS perspective, if you see something like that and you see the likes of Hibernate immediately indicate that it's something within the database. And in relation to this issue itself, it's a common enough one that we see in GSS, where customers have added hosts or data stores recently into vCenter. And due to an issue with the property collector, which is responsible for the events that come into vCloud, it pulls in a second copy of that. So sorry. Okay. And what you'll see is that there's two instances of ESXi 1E. So I thought I had that correct. Display now. And you'll see that this is the one that's kind of causing it. Now, obviously from a GSS perspective, from a VMware perspective, never ever recommend a customer to modify anything in the database directly. This is just for illustration purposes of what we would be doing with a ticket. Now the database here is already backed up. Okay, so we'll check that they're unique, and okay. Do a reconnect just to make sure what they should be picking up, that there's a unique one now in the database. Yeah, so it's now pulling in that information correctly.
Okay, so in this scenario, in a nice little lab, this is nice and easy to kind of get deep into. In a reality of a production environment, there may be quite a few errors going into logs, depending on, I guess, logging levels need to be looked at here as well.
Yeah, one thing we do see, and again, depending on the service provider, they might be pushing everything out to a centralized logging system. But if they're not, the default logging itself of vCloud, I would kind of say would be insufficient for most service provider needs.
Yeah, I think what should be said that the debug log that you are using here to actually get the stack trace could get in a big environment overwritten quite quickly. So even if you capture the log bundle, it might not even contain that error anymore, right? And it's already rolled out and overwritten. So if you have that centralized logging solution, that's obviously preferable.
Yeah, the default logs for vCloud would be, and the debug.log, as Thomas mentioned, is the main one. Now you have an info.log, which is an info version of that. But each of those, they write to a current .log, and then they'll keep by default 9 other iterations, and they're only 10 megabytes each. So as Thomas pointed out there, as soon as your environment is kind of doing anything really, and especially if you introduce anything like automation, those logs, I've seen instances where, those 10 logs aren't even capturing 2 minutes worth of data.
Yeah.
Can you adjust the file size here and change the max index number?
Yeah, so you could modify the values here. Now, depending on the version of vCloud, you may or may not have to restart the service. But yeah, a lot of customers that we still see kind of coming into us will still have the 10 megabytes and 9 max backup indexed.
So the logging is done through the infamous log4j. What you should understand is that not all logs on the appliance are actually managed through this log4j. There are also other logs that you might be interested in, and you should also capture centrally. So how would you do so, right? How would you redirect your logs to a central location? So one way is to use the log4j mechanism to forward the logs to a external syslog. But as I mentioned, that would not catch up all the logs. I guess the preferred solution would be use an agent-based log collection. So for example, the vRealize log inside has its own agent that you can install on every cell, even on the appliance supported. And then you can define which logs from the appliance you are interested in. So for example, it would be all logs in the log cloud directory, or it could be also the appliance logs, it could be the VMware logs, it could be also the Postgres logs. So you could select those, and the agent will take care and forwarding them to your central location.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, right? Because with the Flex Core, the vRealize login site is included in that bundle. Do you see a lot of providers using that by default, or are they using their own other logging tools?
Yes, I think our login site is a very good solution. A lot of providers are using it. It's also very easy to then query. It also provides built-in dashboards for vCloud Director, right? And obviously you can create your own dashboards that help you to easily look for stuff that you are interested in.
Yeah,
and that's something. I mean, we've seen here when you remember the architecture diagram that Daniel showed at the beginning. That was a very high level, like a conceptual diagram. If you like zoom into different things, that one box of a cloud director in the real world might be multiple cells, hopefully, with multiple like a replicated database, a load balancer in front of that, and to have these log files from all these different components send their logs in a central log environment, that simplifies a lot of the like relationship gathering between these different components. And in login side, we've also seen in the the browser log that Daniel showed for the request, like the request ID, which is a generic ID that's generated for all the different tasks that might be started from a user either through the UI or even through the API. And this IDs, they show up in error messages that pop up or that you can see in the task list in Cloud Director. And of course, they show up when you do like API calls and you get them back as a header for the response from the Cloud Director cell. And these request IDs, they are very helpful because they allow you to very easily, in a central log management, create some filters and then filter like the logs from that particular cell, and then look at the same time logs from other components, coming in to figure out like a bigger picture of what happened in the environment.
Yeah, that's one thing I was going to ask, because you get a stack trace of where something went wrong in the debug log, but the thing that may have gone wrong may have been the fault of another component, a call that didn't provide the right format back or didn't respond back. So when I'm calling GSS, then Daniel, I'm going to have to provide you some log files. If I'm centrally logging everything, it's going to get quite difficult for me to identify the timestamp of the log. I'll be able to run obviously queries and do my investigation myself, because Log Insight will let you do that, as Joerg said, by object ID perhaps. But if I have to then try and find the logs and segregate the logs for a particular ticket, that could be quite a time-consuming and difficult process to do.
Yeah, I think depending on the issue itself, so if it's something that has happened previously and it's not something that you can foresee happening again, or something that we don't feel is going to pop up, that's, I think, where it might get a bit trickier. And again, most folks in GSS should at least by now have gone through some form of kind of Log Insight training. So it's either a case of you take an export from Log Insight and you supply that to the support request, or it's over a Zoom and you can have a look through the Log Insight logs there. What I would always recommend, though, if it's something that you can reproduce live, then into the ticket, request a Zoom session with GSS. There's no better time to look at something than look at it live. And it saves a massive amount of time. The amount of time it takes to get your logs, to upload them, to update the ticket, and to then kind of wait for that person from GSS to be available to look over those. I think you'd save a massive amount of time if you got a Zoom for things like that. But I think it all kind of does come back to one of Thomas's first points, that the more prepared you are when you log the ticket, the better a chance you have of getting somebody kind of more immediate.
And Thomas, just the reality of the situation when we're looking at, especially if we're looking at debug logs, we're probably going to see lots of errors in debug logs of different levels. And do I want to be, as a service provider, looking into each of those? Is there a characteristic I can look for that will help me speed things up? Because I'm just thinking, if I had all of my logs centralized, what I could then start doing is obviously using something like Virtualized Log Insight. I could then start, alarming on stack trace errors, for example, and pulling in the content of that stack trace error into an event that I can then go and investigate. But these also can be simple configuration problems, stuff that's been around for a while with a particular piece of code, for example, that could also produce those errors, and that might be just quite normal behavior.
Right. Yeah. So, and that's the tough part, right? So all the errors could be different types. There could be bugs in the code. There could be maybe some unsupported configuration by the platform underneath. So, for example, you are trying to deploy something that the platform doesn't support, right? And VCD obviously it's not going to be able to do so. It could be some environmental issue, like your DNS certificate or your NTPs are not set up properly, and you will get those problems as well. So I guess that means what you want to do is try to kind of with a detective work to find out what could be the area where you should be looking at. So if it's a bug in the code, really in VCD, I guess the best would be, can I reproduce it in a small environment, and then I can clearly show it, and I don't need to do anything with my production environment and send big logs, because I can clearly show that this is happening every time in this particular case. And that's the best for the engineering then to go and fix the bug. If it's something environmental, those are hard to get, because they usually you get all these red herrings in the logs. You think it's something, it's buggy, but it could be just the time it's incorrectly set up somewhere. The time zone, the NTP is not working, or the certificate has expired. So in that case, it really is more about the experience and about your hunch, to see where the issue could be happening. And then what you always try to isolate and get rid of the things that work. And if a VCD seems to be working properly in general, but for this particular case, for this particular cluster, or NSX environment, it doesn't work. Just focus on that. Maybe get VCD out of the picture, and just try to redo the same or similar task directly in NSX, and see whether this problem could be specific just to the environment, and try to isolate the problem that way. So that's how I would approach this. The logs usually give you an idea where the issue is happening, right? But and that basically you then go through another step, go directly to that platform, see the platform logs, what issue could be happening there, and maybe you will get again redirected somewhere else, and that's how we do that.
Usually in the vCloud logs, if the errors are coming from an underlying element within the platform, so like vCenter or NSX, usually the error message that gets bubbled up has its own kind of notation format. So things with Vim, like a Vim fault, will indicate that it's somewhere in vCenter. If you get something with an error code, so it says the actual words error code, then followed by, I think it's a 5 or 6 digit error code number, that again would indicate it's NSX or NSXT. So yeah, it's all about that, and kind of just isolating those down. And at any point, if you do feel like it's coming from those areas, then it's always a good case to just, if possible, pull those kind of logs and get those up to the ticket.
Yeah, and also you don't really need to go into the cell logs to see the stack trace, or to see that NSX popped up error message. Even from the VCD UI, if you have the right credentials and you see the failed task, you can get the information directly from there, and that might help you. So obviously the system administrator would see that, but there is also a specific right that you can give to your tenants. So if you think your tenants are savvy enough, or they have direct access to that part of the infrastructure, you can give them the elevated privilege for that right, and they can then see the full error message, and they can go into their own managed vCenter and see what's wrong there.
Yeah, we have kind of, apologies, Joerg. I was just going to say that we have, we're a tenant, I suppose, within VMware's own internal labs. And the labs sysadmins have given us elevated privileges because we support the product. And more often than not, when something does fail, we're savvy enough to give them the information to go and fix it. So that's a super useful point there from Tomas.
Yeah, absolutely. And that also follows like the one of the big paradigms in VCD, that separation between provider concerns and tenant self-service capabilities. So I think in the default settings, it's rather restricted intentionally. So you're from a tenant user, when you log in with a tenant user and you do some tasks and things break, or you get a task fails to deploy a new virtual machine, for instance, you get a pretty generic error message that just says the infamous contact your cloud administrator. And that's the whole point of running in a cloud and consuming the service, where you don't care about the underlying infrastructure. And then it's up to the service provider. If they, with the service provider credentials, look at the very same task, they see a lot of more information there that already might help to pinpoint to some issues when it's not like a hard error, but things like a configuration error of a virtual machine that you try to, I don't know, clone something with an IDE drive or something that's just not supported there, or have some very old version or templates or whatever. And so the service provider operational teams, they already can see a lot of more information. And yeah, as Thomas mentioned, if you have tenants that are tech savvy enough and that can help, well, do something with the information that they might get from that error message, then you can give them the needed privileges via the rights and roles bundles and the propagation there to the tenants to yeah, give them more information.
Particularly if they've got access to that infrastructure, right? So if it's a vCenter that they're managing, for example,
which is usually in a dedicated private cloud business model where they have that access where it makes sense. Of course, in a shared environment, typically it doesn't make sense because you don't want to give them any information about the underlying infrastructure or share, I don't know, names of data stores or stuff like that, that they just will never access directly and they don't have to see and that they can't do anything with the information anyway.
So it seems to me there's quite a lot of consideration that needs to be put into the logging itself, and obviously, you know, that's a kind of a very important thing for service providers in any case. Is there any recommendations out there for? I mean, we covered two things, right? Log rotation and log size, and well, three things in logging levels. But is there any recommendations out there on how these should be configured?
Yeah, so I mentioned the login side and the agent-based collection. That's my recommended approach. I have a blog post that I update from time to time as the appliances, change and add additional log files. You can collect them easily, and that's the best thing about login side is that once you have that environment set up, your agents are installed on those cells. You can just centrally through the login side, modify which logs you are interested in. If there are additional ones, you just add additional filters and the formats of the logs, and login side will automatically distribute that to your agents, and agents will start sending the new logs to your central location, and login side will understand those logs and properly parse them for your querying. So that's definitely the recommended approach, and that goes for the VCD environment itself. But then obviously you also have to do the same for the platform, and I would say most of our solutions, especially if you are using a VMware Cloud Foundation, already pre-configure your Virtualized login side for the collection, so that should be taken care of. If you don't, if you use third-party collection mechanism, then you will have to take care of that on your own, and probably go through the best practices for each of that solution, whether it's a vSphere, NSX, or similarly, and get those logs forwarded to the right location.
In addition to the logs, also be aware of the different APIs that we have that return like health status of appliances, where we did a lot of improvements over, especially in the last couple of versions, actually based on a lot of provider feedback. So the cell APIs do now provide some health status that you can gather programmatically, and that can be part of your monitoring solution that we discussed earlier. And also be aware that we have that audit trails API or logs in the cell appliance, where you can select if that's should be written to a log file as well, or it's available through the database or via an API. And that audit trail gives you a pretty comparable log file like we've seen for the UI browser logs. So it logs pretty much every action that all the users do in that environment. And of course, it's meant for audit purposes, but it also might help troubleshooting if you have some customers complaining that they get multiple or a lot of errors over and over again. Then you might be able to get some very quick insight into that using the audit trail and see that they have some multiple requests, just, I don't know, with an old template that doesn't work anymore, things like that.
Yeah, so good points there. And one of the things I'm thinking of then is you could use vRealize Operations for this and boil up some of those API calls if you wished into like some sort of super metric, so you can keep an eye on the infrastructure as a whole.
Yeah, that's possible as well. I mean, the VCD content pack already enables vRealize Operations to understand the different object structure within VCD and also their relationship to the underlying infrastructure like vSphere and NSX. So you see, I don't know, NSX edge devices that belong to a certain organization VDC and therefore to a certain organization and a certain tenant in vRealize Operations. So these environment view and these like dependency views are very powerful as a provider for your operational teams because they allow very quickly to pinpoint if something goes wrong, what dependencies are there. So if, I don't know, a certain vCenter is not reachable anymore, you quite quickly see which tenants are actually impacted by that. And same for maintenance planning, for example, can be very helpful.
And I'm seeing, so more and more these days, we're seeing cloud providers deliver their cloud service to their customers over the internet with using the VCD UI and skinning and branding the VCD UI in their own look and feel. So I think now there's also a synthetic kind of testing that we need to also be mindful of the fact that these are people who are remote and accessing, web calls and web UI. So their experience has got to be good. So there's a certain amount of remote synthetic UI testing, perhaps, that should also be built into the service level to kind of detect where there are latency issues or performance issues with the UI, or critically functional errors with the UI as well.
Yeah, that's something that can be done either by some other third-party service that just tests your public endpoint, or of course, on the other hand, typically your web application firewall or load balancer that sits in front of the portal is the go-to point for this kind of analysis to figure out if any latency comes from within the system or if it's rather something that's related to the internet connection or to the client's internet connection or the user's internet connection.
Okay, yeah. So looking at the service as a whole, then we've got some, we've got the logs, we've got the capabilities of the different logging levels, and Thomas has got some blogs on that for everyone to read as well. But there's also the take advantage of the work that we've done with the vRealize Operations Management Pack for VCD and the vRealize Log Insight pack for VCD, because then you've got a lot of those best practices already coded in and those views ready for you. I'm going to say one thing. It's probably a little bit of a contentious point, but I'm going to mention it. Does Skyline help with the rest of the components? Now, I know it's not supported with Cloud Director, but if you're using it to cover the vSphere environment, the NSX environment, is this like another best practice that service providers should look at?
Yeah, so I think for Skyline, when it's part of the, or you have access to based on your contract, then I think it for sure helps identifying some misconfigurations that you might have in your basic platform in vSphere, NSX, VCF, whatever. Just even if you are using that like from a VCD perspective, and VCD might not care about that particular configuration because it does not touch this kind of configuration, I think it's still a good idea because it helps to have a certain baseline of quality in your configuration for the base infrastructure.
Okay.
I think one of the good things as well that I don't think we kind of broadcast enough is the work that engineering are kind of doing in the background to, I suppose, plug the gaps between the application and the environment itself. So built in with 10.3, you have the start of some health checks that are in there. So it's like a cloud health check that's built in, and that will create a log file when log bundles are generated as well. Now you can do it manually, but it gives you an overview, as Thomas was saying, the likes of your NTP, your DNS. It's going to check the sizing of the cell as well against the sizing guides, disk space. There's port checks, a lot of those kind of things that I think we kind of take for granted once something has been deployed, that it's never going to kind of break or something like that. But yeah, that's always a good point to check as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good point. When you're looking at the service, you've got to take all of the components in the service into account. You know, from Joerg mentioning, right, web application firewalls to load balancers to NTP settings and all sorts of stuff that needs to be taken into account to provide a stable service. So is there, Daniel, is there a way then that a service provider can quickly gather logs? And is that what you were saying in terms of a call they can make that will gather the logs from a particular duration?
No, I suppose what I'm trying to get at, Guy, is that there's work being kind of put into the product to allow us to, I suppose, quickly and easily do troubleshooting that A, we should probably have done anyway, but B, it's usually kind of slow and cumbersome when you try to jump through the individual parts. So a lot of the things that get kind of overlooked would be, we'll say, like the networking config. So there's work gone in, and I'm fairly sure that there's still work ongoing to, validate open ports based on our VMware documentation, things like that. But in a nutshell, the cell management tool has a lot of this stuff kind of embedded in there already, and it's just for quickly checking the health of your cells, just to make sure that they're at the stage where they should be. If you're providing a production support level agreement with your customers.
And was that introduced in 10.3, did you say?
10.2.2 is where it initially started. No, I think the health check stuff came in initially in 10.3.0, but 10.2.2 was kind of the start of it. So there's a lot of stuff there that gets kind of pulled from the database really, and other sources like appliance logs and the actual application logs themselves. So if you want to take, for instance, database HA, might be called a few different things by customers and whatnot, but it's the Postgres replication that happens between the appliance nodes. One of the health checks there checks the two main services, the appliance sync and the sync timer, to make sure that they're running. It'll print out some last statements from the sync logs that are there. So again, in a nutshell, you can quite quickly check 5 or 6 kind of different things. There's plans for, we'll say, to expand upon that to check more the rep manager kind of outputs and whatnot. But yeah, I think there's a lot of work kind of going into cutting out all of the time taken up by repetition.
Yeah, absolutely. And that sounds highly needed. In fact, I mean, today that probably gives you a view on things. Is that something that is also queryable via API?
Currently, I don't think that's via the API. I think you do need to log on to the cells, but a database HA case, again, depending on TSE level and experience, and all of the various commands and areas you need to go to, a validation there can take you up to an hour and a half, maybe more. Whereas you can run this on your cells and it'll take maybe 10 or 15 seconds, and you have your outputs. So it's all about, I wouldn't say cutting corners, but making good use of the time. Well,
and the facilities that engineering are building to give you back minutes of your day.
Yeah, and to get the service providers back up much quickly as well.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, guys, is there anything else to add about, I think we covered the identification. We covered certainly some of the logging aspects, some of the surrounding aspects around the solution as a whole. For me, that's what I wanted to get out today. I think that will really help our service providers understand what's available to them, and Daniel hopefully be able to quicker route the tickets to you with the correct information. Any final thoughts, guys?
I have one final thought, just to keep in mind that our colleagues over in the professional services team also offer a lot of services around VCD when it comes to design and deploying new infrastructure, of course, helping with upgrades and migrations. But I think there's also a health check available for VCD and the underlying infrastructure. So that's something which might be helpful as part of a migration planning, or if you have a larger upgrade that is a project that's due, have a look at our professional services offerings and see if they can help you just to get the environment into a known state that you can upgrade or migrate from.
Yeah, that's a great point. Health checks.
From my experience, what really helps is if the person that is involved in the troubleshooting, so whether it's the administrator, the operator, or the architect, really understands the environment, gets the high-level picture, understands all the components that are involved, has a picture as was shown in the beginning, somewhere on their wall, and they understand also what are the third-party components that are leveraging or are somehow connected to VCD, and that really helps. The more those people are educated, the more they are able to resolve those issues on their own and focus and quickly find out what is the problematic component of the whole solution.
Yeah, I think we'd see that quite a lot actually, Thomas. Now that you've mentioned it, that the person that might be responsible for vCloud might not be the person that's responsible, or I suppose knowledgeable on the load balancing side or the networking side of the house. So just from a TTR or time to resolution aspect, we could see cases going on for 3 or 4 days whilst they're waiting for internal people to come back. So again, if there's stuff on the application side to allow us to get that time back in our day, then I think from a service provider perspective, as Thomas said, the more you can kind of bridge that gap, again, the more delays you can kind of cut out there on that side as well.
Yeah, and of course, the bigger the service provider, the more likelihood they are to have separate teams doing all sorts of different things. But yeah, that's the way of things. So yeah, and then the tool, Daniel, that you mentioned earlier around the appliance checking would be able to really help again identify that issue potential area. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time today. It's been a really interesting chat, and have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, Guy.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you. Bye-bye.